The US owes $36 trillion. Japan owes more than its entire economy is worth, and somehow neither of them is panicking. Meanwhile, Sri Lanka collapsed. Argentina keeps begging for bailouts. Same debt, completely different outcomes. Why? That's exactly what we're breaking down today. Every level of country debt, what it means, who they owe, and why some countries thrive under debt while others get buried by it. We're going deep today. 5 sections, real numbers, no fluff. By the end of this video, you'll understand debt better than most adults, and honestly, better than some politicians making decisions about it right now. Before we get into it, if you're new here, this channel breaks down money, wealth, and how the financial system actually works. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Now, let's get into it. What is national debt? Let's start at the foundation. What actually is national debt? Think of a country like a household. It earns income through taxes. It has bills, military spending, roads, hospitals, schools, government salaries, social programs. When the bills are consistently bigger than the income, the government borrows the difference. That gap doesn't disappear. It stacks year after year. That stack is national debt. But here's what most people get wrong. National debt is not the same as your personal debt or even a company's debt. When you owe money, one wrong move and the bank takes your car, your house, your credit score. When a country owes money, especially a powerful one, the rules are completely different. Countries negotiate, they restructure, they issue new debt to cover old debt. And in some cases, they just keep borrowing indefinitely because the world keeps lending to them. Also important, national debt only refers to what the central or federal government owes. In the United States, that $36 trillion figure doesn't include what California owes. It doesn't include what Texas owes. State and local governments carry their own separate debt, and it has nothing to do with what American citizens personally owe on credit cards, student loans, or mortgages. That's a whole different number and a whole different conversation. So, national debt is specifically the total accumulated borrowing of the federal government over time. Every year the government spends more than it collects. That's called a budget deficit. The deficit for that year gets added to the total national debt. Do that for decades and you get $36 trillion. Now, the obvious question, why don't governments just spend within their means? Or better yet, why don't they just print more money and solve the problem? Let's get into that. Why do countries borrow? This is where it gets interesting. There are 5 core reasons countries borrow, and not all of them are signs of weakness. Reason 1, budget shortfalls. The most obvious reason, the government collected $3 trillion in taxes. It needs $4 trillion to run the country. That $1 trillion gap has to come from somewhere. The options on the table aren't pretty. Cut services, people protest. Hospitals get underfunded. Schools deteriorate. Raise taxes, people protest louder. Businesses slow down. So the path of least resistance, borrow the gap. Deal with it later. This is how most governments operate most of the time. Reason 2, investing in growth. Not all borrowing is desperation. Some of it is strategy. Imagine a country needs a national highway system, new power grids, and modern ports. These projects cost billions up front, but they generate economic activity for decades. More trade, more jobs, more tax revenue. The logic is the same as a business taking a loan to expand. You borrow now, build something that earns more than it costs, and the debt pays itself. When it works, this is exactly how developing nations are supposed to grow. When it doesn't work, we'll get to that. Crises and emergencies. Nobody budgets for a pandemic. Nobody has a line item for a tsunami or a war that starts overnight. In 2020 alone, the United States borrowed $3.8 trillion in a single year. That's roughly 18% of its entire GDP, borrowed in 12 months to fund COVID relief, stimulus checks, and business aid. Without that injection, economists estimate unemployment could have exceeded 25%. The entire economy could have seized. Sometimes borrowing isn't a choice, it's the only tool fast enough to stop the bleeding. Reason 4, paying old debt with new debt. This one sounds alarming because it is.
A country borrowed heavily in 2010, the repayment deadline arrives in 2020, but the economy is struggling. The money isn't there. So what happens? They issue new bonds, take a fresh loan, use it to pay off the old one, kick the deadline forward. As long as investors believe the country can eventually pay, the cycle continues. When that belief breaks down, you get what happened to Sri Lanka in 2022. $51 billion in external debt. The government ran out of foreign currency, couldn't buy fuel, hospitals went dark, citizens stormed the presidential palace. That's what happens when the debt cycle breaks. Reason 5. Controlling the economy itself. This one surprises most people. Governments don't always borrow because they need cash. Sometimes they borrow as a financial tool. By issuing bonds and pulling money out of circulation, governments can slow down inflation when an economy is running too hot. By borrowing and injecting that money back in through spending, they can stimulate growth when the economy slows. Debt as a lever, not just a lifeline. Central banks and finance ministries use this constantly. It's one of the primary instruments of economic management. Now, back to the original question. Why not just print money instead of borrowing? The answer is one word: inflation. When a government prints money without backing it with real economic output, it floods the system with cash. More money chasing the same amount of goods means prices rise. If it gets out of control, it becomes hyperinflation, where prices double every few weeks and savings become worthless overnight. Venezuela printed money to cover their debts. Their currency became so devalued, people were using it as wallpaper. Zimbabwe printed money. Inflation hit 89 sextillion% at its peak. Borrowing, despite its risks, forces discipline. Debt comes with interest. Interest demands repayment. Repayment forces governments to manage their finances or face consequences. Who do they actually owe? This is the question that gets people. If countries owe trillions, who has trillions to lend? The answer is no single source. Government debt comes from 3 main categories of lenders. Category 1, domestic lenders. The first source is the country's own people, institutions, and agencies. This works through bonds. When a government needs to borrow, it issues bonds, essentially IOUs, with a promise to pay back the original amount plus interest after a set period. Anyone can buy them. Individual citizens, commercial banks, pension funds, investment firms, insurance companies, ETFs, even other government agencies. That last one is worth pausing on. In the United States, government agencies like Social Security hold massive amounts of Treasury bonds. Social Security collects more in payroll taxes than it pays out in benefits, at least historically. That surplus doesn't sit in a vault. It gets invested in Treasury bonds. Foreign lenders. Governments also borrow from outside their borders. Foreign citizens, banks, and governments all buy bonds from other countries. Japan holds approximately $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds. China holds around $700 billion. Why would foreign countries lend to the United States? Because U.S. Treasury bonds are considered the safest investment on the planet. The U.S. has never defaulted. The dollar is the world's reserve currency. Holding U.S. bonds is how other nations store their wealth securely while earning steady interest. But this only works for countries with strong economies and trusted currencies. What about weaker nations? Foreign investors won't buy their bonds, too risky. Instead, weaker economies turn to direct institutional lending. And then there's the lender of absolute last resort, the IMF. The International Monetary Fund steps in when a country is in economic fail-froth and nobody else will touch them. IMF loans are emergency lifelines. They come with low interest but brutal conditions. Cut government spending, raise taxes, privatize state-owned industries, reform the entire economic structure. Greece accepted IMF terms after its 2010 debt crisis. The result was years of austerity, mass unemployment, and civil unrest. Argentina has gone back to the IMF multiple times.
Most economists start getting nervous around 90 to 100%. Japan sits above 260%. The United States is above 120%. By conventional logic, both should be in crisis, but they're not. Why? Because the ratio alone doesn't tell the whole story. What matters just as much is who holds the debt, what currency it's denominated in, and how much trust the global financial system places in that country's ability to repay. Default, when a country stops paying, is the end of that road. It's not bankruptcy in the legal sense. A country can't be liquidated, but it gets cut off from international credit markets. Its currency collapses. Its economy contracts sharply. Sri Lanka in 2022, Argentina in 2001, Russia in 1998. The pattern repeats. Default is survivable, but the damage lasts years. Can a country ever be debt-free? Short answer, technically yes. Practically, almost never. And for most major economies, being debt-free would actually cause serious problems. The closest real-world example is Macau. It carries essentially zero national debt. But Macau isn't a sovereign nation. It's a special administrative region of China. It has around 700,000 people, an area about half the size of Manhattan, and it generates extraordinary revenue from its casino industry, more gambling revenue than Las Vegas. You can't scale that model to a country of 300 million people with a military, an aging population, and a complex welfare system. Norway comes up in these conversations because of its sovereign wealth fund, over $1 trillion built on oil revenue. Norway still carries some debt, but its assets far exceed its liabilities. That's the closest a real nation gets to genuine financial security. But Norway had decades of massive oil wealth and a small population. Again, not a replicable model for most countries. For most nations, eliminating debt would require either catastrophic spending cuts or tax increases so severe they'd collapse domestic demand and trigger deep recessions. And here's the part most people don't consider. The world needs government bonds to exist. Pension funds globally rely on government bonds as their primary low-risk asset. Insurance companies hold them. Central banks hold them. The entire architecture of global finance is built on the assumption that government debt is available to buy. If major governments eliminated their debt, there would be a shortage of safe assets. Financial markets would be forced into higher-risk alternatives. Volatility would increase. Retirement funds would be less secure. The system actually depends on countries carrying manageable levels of debt. That's the paradox. Debt is not the enemy. Unmanaged debt is the enemy. A country that borrows to build, invests the proceeds wisely, maintains credibility with its lenders, and keeps its debt-to-GDP ratio at a level the economy can support, that country uses debt as a growth engine. A country that borrows to plug corruption, fund vanity projects, or simply survive because its economy produces nothing, that country is building a crisis. So the next time you hear that a country is drowning in debt, don't panic and don't assume. Ask the real questions. What did they borrow for? Who do they owe? What's the ratio? Can they service it? Because the number alone means nothing without context. Japan at 260% isn't collapsing. Sri Lanka at far less imploded. The difference isn't the debt, it's everything surrounding it. If this broke it down in a way that actually made sense, hit the like button. It helps more people find this content. Subscribe if you want to keep building this kind of knowledge. And drop in the comments, what country's debt situation do you want us to break down next? We'll see you